All right. I am hoping that everybody is able to see and hear me without any difficulty. Welcome to Black Citizenship Today, part two of a two-part series, the conversation about what it means to be Black today. I'm Dr. Larissa Werhnyak. I am the program head for American Studies at UT Dallas. And I'm so grateful to be able to participate in this program. As a field, American Studies has a long history of attempting to grapple with issues of equity and justice, accessibility, fairness and unfairness, that have been so foundational to the American experience. Sometimes those grapplings have been successful and sometimes not, but I appreciate the commitment to the overall project, and it's one of my goals to be able to continue that tradition. So we have three panelists today. We're so pleased to have been able to bring them together. They will each be speaking for a time, and after that, we will have a Q&A period with some questions that were pre-submitted and also some questions that can be contributed during the presentation. So we will move directly down the speaker list. We will hear first from Sarah Mccurry. She works as a senior associate at PolicyLink, where she brings high-level experience in project management, program design, and community engagement, combined with lifelong passions for justice, equity, and arts and culture. She's a co-founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality and a founding partner of the Steward Cultural. She holds a bachelor's degree from New School University and 2 master's degrees from Simmons College. Sarah has served as a board member at the Dallas Peace Center, Parents as Teachers program at Lumen Education, and on the International Mechanism Coordinating Committee for the U.S. Human Rights Network. Mccurry has taught high school in Dallas and Boston and college at UTD and Paul Quinn College. She's a mother and lives with her family in Dallas, Texas. Sarah, I will turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here with everyone. I'm really excited to be in conversation, and my hope is to really not take up too much space with opening statements, but really just to get into some dialogue. But I'll just start with, I think this past year and this moment that we are in has reminded us or brought this conversation to the forefront once again in terms of what it means to have full citizenship as Black people in this country. And so we know that under law, it's been well less than a century since Black folks have had full protection under the law, and that can even be contested in so many ways. But in practice, we know that we still don't have full citizenship. And so what I'd really like us to do today is spend time talking about or leaving with clarity in terms of what the mechanisms that are constricting and creating the lack of access to full citizenship in this country. Perhaps talk about, is it even possible for us to really live this idea of pluralism in this country? And then what are ways of resistance, right? So even though much of what we're going to talk about and what we're talking about creates despair, at least it does for me, even in despair, we must fight, we must resist, and always push forth our humanity. So I'll just pause there, and I'm so grateful for the invitation and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Our second panelist is Michael Phillips. He is a scholar of American race relations. Texas history, right-wing politics, and apocalyptic religions. Phillips grew up in Garland, Texas, an award-winning reporter for the student newspaper The Shorthorn. He received a journalism degree from UT Arlington in 1983. He worked at various newspapers in North Texas in the 1980s, including the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. He received his PhD from UT Austin in 2002. His dissertation was published in 2006 by the University of Texas Press as White Metropolis, Race, Ethnicity, and Religion in Dallas, 1841 to 2001. That book won the 2007 Texas Historical Commission's Prize for the best book on Texas history. Since 2007, he has taught American history at Collin College in Plano. He's on the board of directors for the East Texas Historical Association, and in 2019 won a Mellon ACLS Community College Faculty Fellowship to research the history of the eugenics movement in Texas. He's currently under contract with the University of Oklahoma Press to write The Strange Career of Eugenics in Texas, 1854 to 1940. Over to you.
Thank you for having me today. This year was emotionally overwhelming, and on two fronts. And it was personal for me because I think it really illustrated how my profession has failed. For about 100 years after the Civil War, a mythology was taught about the American past regarding slavery, regarding the Confederacy, regarding Reconstruction, and it had a specific design. The design was to delegitimize any struggle for justice that African Americans had by minimizing the cruelty of slavery, by suggesting the Civil War was not about slavery, to erase the horrors of Reconstruction, to also make vanish the phenomena of lynching. And so white America, and this included liberals, I was struck by, I had this sense of progress, that things were getting better. But what I know is that Black people and white people live on the same planet, but different worlds. And they were aware of the continuous violent experience of dealing with the police. They're aware of the violence that comes from environmental racism, the damage it does to Black and brown bodies. They were aware of the economic exploitation when they find work, the lower wages, the the phenomena of being the first laid off, et cetera, even with reforms and protections. And it was interesting, we had the confluence of COVID-19, which turned out to be a sort of passive genocide in which Black people in particular have died at twice the rate that white people have. Disproportionately, people of color are frontline workers who are the most exposed, the least likely to have health insurance, and the ones whose bodies have already been damaged by monstrosities like Shingle Mountain and other examples of environmental racism. We had that phenomena, and then the uprisings that took place over police violence, particularly after George Floyd was murdered. And it was interesting that the public successfully made the connection between the legacy of the Confederacy and anti-Black oppression and violence today. And they took it into their hands by taking down these monstrous icons of white supremacy across the country. They tumbled one place after another. It was the people who did that. Scholars contributed to this, but this was an uprising of the people. And I'm skeptical of white society. I've studied long enough to to believe that, well, maybe this is a long-term lesson that will be remembered. But I think it was revealing the society in all its rapacious greed and all its callous indifference to human suffering. This was an eye-opener for people fed on the idea of American exceptionalism.
Thank you. Our third panelist, Brian Arnold, is a historian, whose research focuses on Black women, Black and African diaspora, and local history. She was born and currently lives in Detroit, Michigan. Ryan attended Bowling Green State University, earning a bachelor's in women's gender and sexuality studies with a minor in ethnic studies in 2016, as well as an MA in history in 2018. After finishing grad school, Ryan worked at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit from 2018 to 2020. In her spare time, she volunteers with a local organization called Making It to the Finish Line that focuses on the empowerment and mentorship of young girls. In addition to her service, Ryan currently works as a middle school art teacher and mentor.
Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me? Okay, awesome. Hello, everybody. I'm Ryan, and I'm excited to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me for this conversation. I agree with both of you all said. This year for me has been very challenging because I think my own definition and personal definition of being Black has definitely shifted and has been challenged. So it was brought up like the shootings, even talking about it sometimes makes me very upset because here in Detroit, are you all like in Texas? Yeah, so in Detroit, we already have, other issues that we have to deal with. We have to deal with like bad infrastructure, gentrification right now. That is just taking over the city, and not in a necessarily negative way, but it's pushing Black people back out and isolating us. And we've just been seeing a lot of stuff happening locally, but as well as nationally. To me, the most disturbing thing that I saw being an adult was the storming of the Capitol recently. Even though I hear stories like things like that can happen, seeing that and seeing the outcome of that has really surprised me, and I don't understand why it surprised me because it has always historically things have happened and the same consequences. People get off, people get to go back home, people get to go back to work, but we constantly are seeing these shootings of young Black men being killed, innocent Black men and women being killed by not just the police, but these oppressive systems in the prisons, schools. I work in a school, and I work in Highland Park, Michigan. I don't know if you ever heard of Highland Park, Michigan, but it's a small city within Detroit, and it's one of the like most impoverished cities in Michigan, and it's really challenging seeing these young people and them not understanding, their own Blackness, but not understanding the world outside of them, and it's really hard because they don't get it sometimes. Like they're very influenced by like a lot of the social media, a lot of pop culture, and they're not understanding that outside of Highland Park and outside of Detroit, and sometimes even in Michigan, it can be very scary going to places. Especially, it was brought up earlier before we were talking. Sarah brought it up about you all's governor, and I'm not sure what's necessarily going on in Texas, but here in Michigan, our governor has been criticized. They were trying to kidnap her because of these things that she's been putting in place during this pandemic. And it's really disturbing to me again to start to see the nation's true colors. Like I can read about it all day. I can study it. I can write a thesis on it, but actually experience it has been very challenging and overwhelming. So I'm very excited again to be here, to hear you all, to have a conversation and just, have a better understanding maybe of what's going on today.
Great, thank you so much. As you were speaking, I began to think that possibly the storming of the Capitol is a good starting point, since on the one hand, we've been dealing with the long, slow trauma of COVID for almost a year now, and that has been exacerbated recently with kind of the violent, sudden, immediate trauma of that particular day. And one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting in the aftermath of that incident was people talking about being surprised, not surprised, so forth and so on. And that was language that I heard echoed from you, Ryan. And I think that it's an interesting consideration in terms of situating to think about how we can be simultaneously shocked maybe and not surprised, these emotions at the same time. And it seemed like a good way into our conversation to focus maybe on that particular event, to think about how this fits into the broader context of this year, this period, the things that you are considering in terms of ways forward, things to emphasize, and so forth. I'm not sure if that's too broad of a question to start out with, but I thought it might be a good way to begin to focus in.
Okay, so can you repeat it again? But it wasn't broad, but I want to break it down.
Sure. So just kind of reflecting on really any aspect of, kind of thinking about that particular event in the broader context of the year, where we're seeing parallels or breaks with regard to the issues surrounding COVID, the whole summer and the response to that, some of the debates surrounding monuments and memorials. Obviously, it seems like so many of these things are echoed in various ways in that particular day. And if this is able to provide an inflection point at all in terms of how we can think about moving forward, productive versus unproductive areas of focus and attention and so forth.
I would say that there is a long tradition in American history, multiple incidents of white people banding together with weapons and overthrowing governments grounded in multiracial democracy. Violence defined the Reconstruction era. You had Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898, a multiracial government violently overthrown. There used to be a monument in New Orleans to people who overthrew. David Duke rallied, the Klansmen rallied people to defend this monument in New Orleans. There's so many issues are intertwined this last year with white supremacy. And this really occurred to me, the bizarre resistance to wearing masks. And I realized that there was a white supremacist component to that there, in this history, it's not been local whites who have created more opportunities for democracy and justice. It's been the federal government generally. And it's been centralized governments that have, passed the Reconstruction amendments. A powerful government has frequently been a tool of leveling obstacles that Black and brown people have. Civil Rights Act, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and so on. And so for many of the whites who are so furious about doing a common sense thing that will actually protect their lives, are afraid of a government with expansive powers that might eventually redistribute income, that might actually end gerrymandering, cracking and packing, which tends to keep Black people on the margins in state legislatures. It might actually ensure universal access to health care. It's like a tip of the iceberg to them. And I think that's what a lot of the panic about masks was white panic, in the sense that, there's a demographic reality in 2040 that white people aren't going to be a majority anymore. And I'll always remember what Thomas Jefferson said about slavery, about the possibility of abolishing slavery. He described it as holding a wolf by the ears. You dare not let it go, but you can't hold on to it forever. White people in the deepest denial, who said, oh, racism isn't that bad, et cetera, know it's bad. And they show that by their fear of what happens if Black and brown people are empowered. They fear they're going to get the treatment they gave to Black and brown people, and they're terrified of it. And so this is expressed in very bizarre ways, but I think the mask and the other mandates that Gretchen Whitmer tried to pursue out of common sense is related to that.
Great, thank you.
I definitely agree. And this year, especially, kind of following over from the following summers, but with the Kaepernick thing going on with taking the knee and how people were so angry and livid. I couldn't understand that. Something as simple as taking a knee. And that build up, of course, of the couple of summers in Black Lives Matter. I remember, oh my God, being on campus 2015, right after Mike Brown, and we decided to, just march. Everybody came out and we were like, what were we chanting? We were chanting something. And I just remember people yelling out their windows like he deserved it and shut up. And it was just, that was very disturbing. So I'm sure different campuses and other spaces, people were doing the same thing. And that was just a minor example of that. And so this buildup of Black Lives Matter and the rhetoric that when sometimes people hear Black Lives Matter, they hear what with the rebuttal, Blue Lives Matter, is not the same. Like it has no, it just, to me, again, or when they say all lives matter, if all lives matter, then Black lives have to matter. But we're talking about, again, that historical treatment of Black people in this country, police brutality, slave codes, all of these things historically are connected. And again, throughout the couple summers, the past few summers, just all this buildup. And I think the storming of the Capitol was that final blow up. And I think I agree, because I've heard like my white friends saying, or even people I know who I wouldn't even consider as my friend, but I've heard say problematic things before or make jokes before, were very upset. I can't believe this happened. I can't believe this happened. And it's like, or they're saying it's bad. And it's like, wow, when they have that moment, like, oh, this is bad. It's like, okay, well, we've been dealing with this. And again, I'm only 26. So I could just imagine again what my parents have dealt with, my grandparents have dealt with. And it's starting again, just to put a tiny bit of perspective on it. And again, it becomes overwhelming because again, this was just this build up, and it tipped over. So.
So I'll jump into the conversation as well. I want to bring up Michael, I'm sorry, not Michael, but Derek Bell's concept of whiteness as property. And I think that was fully on display in what we saw at the Capitol. So this idea that whiteness is inherently valuable, and it's built on the subordination of Black folks, right? So the idea of whiteness within itself is predicated on the subordination of Black people, and the way that not only the infrastructure, the structures of policing facilitated that also shows us that policing is grounded in the policing or the maintenance of anti-Blackness and the perpetuation of white supremacy or whiteness as property and value. And so for me, it was a flashpoint, a recent flashpoint that emphasizes what we have known and what we have been saying, or many of us have known and many of us have been saying for a long time. And it is a reminder that racism is not a thing of the past. This idea of white supremacy is not a thing of the past, but these are the very fabrics of this country and the very fabric of the social systems that we're working in. And so to me, it was a reminder of what we're fighting and a reminder of how we need to be thinking about our strategies and what we're fighting, right? Because if you don't understand what you're fighting, then you're not going to be able to fight and dismantle it. And so I think it's important to have that, for me, to understand whiteness in the context of what we saw at the Capitol. And it also provides us a blueprint for how we move forward, right? So we recognize that more police are not the answer. Further entrenchment of surveillance and policing laws are not the answer, because what we saw was not only a flex of white supremacist power, but it was also a reminder that policing is not a public safety mechanism, that is not the function of policing in our society, that the function of policing in our society is to maintain white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And so for me, it was a point of clarity in many ways, just as hopefully we'll talk about this, what's going on with Wall Street, right? That what's happening right now with Wall Street is another example of what the real structures of this country are based in, and how they operate, and how we need to intervene.
Thank you. I was struck, as all three of you were speaking, by some interesting juxtapositions. On the one hand, we have this wave of white supremacist resistance on the grassroots level, which, Michael, you juxtaposed with the federal government and the capacity that it has had, haltingly and imperfectly, to exact some amount of change. But then also we have, as demonstrated in the 2020 election, a totally different form of grassroots activism that really centered members of the Black community, and I think particularly Black women. So we see these two very, very different varieties of activism on that grassroots level. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts about possibly how to use that power to move forward. I know that there are concerns arising already, very much echoing concerns from the past, that, for example, the Democratic Party is perfectly willing to take the votes of Black people, but are unwilling to be responsive to them when it actually comes time to make policy, kind of making apologies for compromises that leave them out, that are kind of committing that erasure. And so I was wondering your thoughts on how that wave of enthusiasm, civic participation, really taking on that burden, can perhaps be focused and directed over the next 2-year election period, 4-year election period, and even outside of the political sphere.
If I can offer a comment here, I think that we should be wary to invest too much in either major political party. There's a plan being discussed about the $15 minimum wage, which really isn't adequate. Yeah, that's $31,000 a year, right? Who's going to do well on that? And they're going to take 4 years to do it. By the time it's fully implemented, it will be irrelevant. We have to figure out how to, we can't, I think too often we're disentangling economic issues from racial issues. We really got to consider, Sarah referred to the property and whiteness. That whiteness as property is, for many whites, compensation for their economic disenfranchisement. That's their symbolic, W.B. Du Bois coined the phrase, the wages of whiteness. And by the way, that's derived from the Bible, right? The wages of sin are death. That's a bad bargain. but that white power you get, that's your compensation. You know, you might be a poor person, but you can enter this neighborhood. If the police stop you, you're not going to get shot. Yeah, that is the compensation you get. But who is manipulating that? Because, and this is a function of white liberalism, that there's a tendency to associate racism, white power, with people in trailer parks, people who are marginalized. It's not that it doesn't exist there, but it really is in the corporate boardrooms. Many powerful white people exchange white sheets for suits and ties, and they're the ones who are driving it. And Trump's base of support was what you might call the petty bourgeoisie, you know, businessmen and people who are wealthier. And so we really need to look at capital itself. These issues aren't disentangled, you know, and I think there's been a tendency lately. One thing that's worried me about the last year, this is about Black citizenship, but white people are part of the equation, that, you know, and this started before, where there are all these, you know, training programs where you're being taught to be an anti-racist. Problem is that that reduces the struggle against white supremacy to a personal improvement project, which in the long term is not going to matter if the structural racism is intact. And I would argue that capitalism has depended on the marginalization of Black and brown workers and holding them as a reserve labor force to keep white workers in check. This is a very conscious manipulation, and you see it play out throughout history. So, you know, there's a question we have later on about Black entrepreneurship. I'm not sure if that's the right question. The question is, does capitalism allow for any advance in racial equality? I think that racism and capitalism essentially are conjoined twins. That will get me fired.
Dr. Werhnyak, can you please repeat the question?
Well,
because it was a good point.
So we kind of started out considering grassroots activism, the role that has played over the course of this particular election campaign. I think kind of consolidating public sentiment surrounding the ending of the Trump administration, going in a different direction, responding to some of these social and economic issues and so forth. And I was really kind of wondering, as we move forward with this, you know, with the recognition that neither of the major political parties is likely to be terribly, completely or fully responsive to those demands, you know, that both of those parties are enthralled to capital, you know, what might be ways to harness that activism in a sense of making it more responsive to the on the ground needs of the people in those communities? Does that make sense?
Yes, and I just wanted a clarification. So we were talking about like grassroots movements. We see Black women, you know, historically have been part of these movements. So we have people like Ella Baker, Diane Nash. These people were the people that were advocating for voting, you know, voting rights. And but then I do agree with Michael was saying. It's like the parties are so, it's just this dichotomy. Like, it's just, I always, you know, at first understood, you know, politics, getting into it being a little bit fluid, but as I've gotten to voting age, it just has become just completely two different things. You're either this or that. You're either left or right. And I feel like sometimes as Black women kind of get caught up in this thing, like we may not necessarily, I don't necessarily believe a lot of the things the Democratic Party do. I know historically, we know they were the party of slaves, enslaved people, and it did switch, but it's just still, I have so many problems with a lot of the policies, but I think it's sometimes we're looking at the overall greater good. How can we get this person out of office and get this person in, and how can we maneuver this to get these policies through and things like that. So sometimes I do feel like we're conflicted internally when it comes to, do we agree? Because we know that neither one of these parties are going to satisfy pretty much anything. Locally, I see a lot of work being done locally and it branches out, but as far as nationally, no. I think Black people, we're constantly, again, we sometimes look at stuff, again, personally, I would say me, I sometimes look at stuff like it doesn't really matter, but what's the lesser of both evils, you know? And I hate to have to like admit that sometimes it's like that, but then I have to also think, okay, well, what are these local elections looking like? Who are we going to vote for locally? Who are we going to vote for statewide? Can they help with these policies? And we are starting to see small changes, but I do believe that these grassroots organizations, again, they are the catalysts. They are at the bottom and they kind of push forward these other movements and put these other ideas in the air. And I believe that, or not in the air, but having the connections with, higher up people, and that's kind of what moves it. But Black women have, again, historically been those groups, even through the 1830s. We have like local societies. We have Philadelphia societies, African American anti-slavery society. So this is historically have been a thing of a group that is always, not always, but sometimes disenfranchised because of our intersectionality of being both Black and women. So we deal with that. But again, I agree with what Michael was saying, where capitalism and racism, they go hand in hand.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say that the fight for freedom has been long and constant, and so it has many different tentacles or mechanisms, and one way is through the electoral justice side of things, in which we've seen, I personally see that as like harm reduction and mitigation. I think of it in terms of the way the Black Panthers called survival programs pending revolution, right? So we recognize that we must survive, we must mitigate harm under the context in which we live, but revolution and the dismantling of racialized capitalism is necessary for our survival and for the freedom dreams that so many of us talk about.
Yeah, I think that is so well said. And from there, I would like to move into a consideration of COVID, because I think that there are some connections between what you're all talking about and the ways that COVID has thrown some of these problems, which we knew were pre-existing, which are not a surprise to anybody, but threw them into sharp relief. And I think that there's a lot to talk about here, different directions that we can go in when we're looking at the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black communities, communities of color more broadly. And when we're thinking about those various levels that you were discussing, Sarah, in terms of, survival and mitigation and ultimately the need for types of revolution, I was wondering if we could start by thinking about just some of the ways that you see the pandemic as particularly and specifically influencing the Black community, whether that has to do with the exacerbation of the wealth gap, whether it relates to, I think you were mentioning, Ryan, the loss of elders, something that I think is so overlooked in the context. It's something on a personal note, I will say that might be the thing that has shocked me, that has surprised me the most. The willingness to perceive our elders as expendable explicitly, that has become so clear. But just to think about what you've seen, what stood out to you, what you maybe are thinking about now that you weren't thinking about or thinking about in the same way a year ago as a consequence of this?
Well, so there's so many aspects of this, and I think that disasters like this epidemic only exacerbate all of the structural issues that exist and impact Black folks, right? So there's too much to unpack, but in the midst of a global pandemic where we have recognized now more than ever how essential so many of our low-wage workers are, right? So how essential our grocery store workers are, how essential our sanitation workers are, et cetera. And how essential, how this government at every level has failed to protect them and us. So that's number one. But number two is we've all been impacted by COVID. The world has been impacted by COVID, but Black people in particular still, while fighting and being disproportionately impacted by COVID, are still being killed by police, right? Are still having to risk our lives by taking to the streets and fighting for our dignity and fighting for not only fighting for our dignity, but claiming our dignity and fighting for our rights, right? So there is the conversion of both the epidemic of COVID-19, but then also of the pervasive racism that exists. On top of all of that, as Michael Phillips talked about earlier, Dr. Phillips talked about earlier, often first to be laid off, right? Most likely not to have health care, most likely to be living in housing that is substandard and creates more issues, right? If you're living in the area around Shingle Mountain, that is still up, which is a mountain that of shingles in Dallas that lets off toxic waste that already creates breathing issues. If you go outside without long sleeves, you are covered in rashes, creates lung issues, asthma, cancer, etc. You are now also dealing with COVID-19, right? We also know, as many say, hospitals for many Black women are what the police are to all Black people. And so there is also the racism that exists within hospitals and the treatment that you get. So then you are dealing with these compounded issues of structural racism and also interpersonal racism, which is on its rise thanks to the former president unleashing and making it normal and pervasive again to display that type of interpersonal racism and violence in the streets. And so all of these things are compounded on top of the everyday things that folks have been dealing with. And so that is in no way an adequate representation of everything, but it is a start for my colleagues Ryan and Michael to continue with.
I think that part of the issue with the response is precisely which workers were at highest risk. People working in fast food, the people who have high amount of contact with the public, who are lower wage workers, and I would even suggest with the classroom. One pathway to the middle class for African Americans and the Latinx community has been to teach, right? And so we've had unsafe protocols in schools. I mean, I think that's a factor. The indifference. It was interesting for me as an educator. At the beginning of COVID, everyone was saying, "Oh, look at these heroic teachers who are adapting, to these online learning strategies and having to remake their classes." But the second that they said, "Well, I'd like to not die connected to my work," all of a sudden they became bad guys. I mean, there really was a shift where teachers were portrayed. We lost a professor at my college. Iris Mita was her name. 70-year-old who had been a nurse at Rikers prison and then at the Sterrett Justice Center. A woman who was 70 who wanted to help during the pandemic. And she was sent to do a dual credit class at an area high school where there was not enough room in the classroom for social distancing. The high school let a symptomatic student into the classroom. She got COVID and died. And when she died, we got an email from the college president where he said, "Happy holidays," and all this news updates. And it was 20 paragraphs in, and he said, "This has been our COVID response. And by the way, we've lost one faculty member, one student." Didn't even name her. I think that I look at the numbers and it's numbing. But I think there's, some people are numb. I think some people are indifferent because of who is getting killed by this. And I tell students, when there's coverage of the, whether people trust the vaccine or not, one thing my African American students have always heard about, universal Tuskegee experiment. They know that. That is part of the shared memory. They don't know as much about Marion Sims and his experiments on Black women. There's been a long, terrible history of racism in white medicine in the United States. And, Black women get ignored when they report their symptoms. They have a hard time getting heard by their doctors. And so, like you're saying, it's a confluence of so many pathologies in the society.
Yes, I agree with both Dr. Phillips and Sarah. Sarah brought up definitely a good point when we were answering the last question, addressing like survival. So we hear a lot about poverty in the United States, but actually seeing it firsthand and actually realizing how many of us do live in poverty when COVID-19 began, I was terrified. I thought the world was ending. I know people, their health care was ending. I got furloughed from both my jobs. So I was, again, terrified. I didn't know, understand what was going on. And I didn't understand a lot of the things I saw my family and friends go through, just because it is not even catching the virus, but the things that came along with it: losing your job, being on unemployment, losing your health care, losing your benefits, losing your 401ks, losing things that you worked up so hard to get, and getting evicted. Even though they, Governor Whitmer, they extended that we wouldn't, certain people wouldn't get evicted. That was still a thing illegally happening. People were being misplaced, becoming homeless. The thing with schools, we're teaching virtually because students, again, they didn't have proper health care because of the situation their parents are in. So people are sick. I mean, it was just a lot of things I really didn't, seeing people really living in poverty really struck me. Also living in Detroit. And again, the narrative that comes out of Detroit, being like a poor city or the murder capital, all these things. We have all these other factors we have to deal with. And then, of course, actually seeing firsthand people living in poverty and making $7.50, but, $7.50, but working 40 to 60 hours a week. It became, even through the pandemic, and even now. And it just became one of those things that I think we have to address. But again, we become afraid when we introduce hospitals again. So we were talking about not having trust with doctors and going into like this vaccine. I have heard a lot of people say they're not getting the vaccine. They don't trust it. They don't want to get the vaccine. Again, like you brought up, Dr. Phillips, the Tuskegee oh, I don't want to get this because of the Tuskegee experiments. And I feel for them in some aspect as far as, again, that distrust between, doctors and Black people. But at the same time, it's also, it's other things that are happening. We had like Serena Williams almost died giving birth in the hospital. This is a famous Black woman. We have things like Henrietta Lacks when she had cervical cancer and they took her cells without letting her family know, and she essentially just died. So again, it's this historical distrust with doctors and hospitals. But moving forward, I think it's also about education and having resources for people, because some people are already living in poverty and have other issues, but then they're also, again, not wanting to get this vaccine. So I think that we should introduce, more resources to make them feel more comfortable talking about that distrust and maybe breaking down those barriers so that we can build up trust with hospitals and doctors and health providers to get these people, get everybody vaccinated, to make safer spaces, make safer schools, make safer homes, taking these precautions to make sure that we're not getting COVID and spreading COVID.
And, I would just want to add one point. So much of the COVID, the CARE Act relief spent at the municipal levels was spent on policing. That money was poured into policing when really the point of that money was to create an infrastructure of support in the midst of this pandemic. And so again, we were failed at every level and not protected in the ways that our communities need to be. That's true. Yes, in the chat, so much COVID money went to corporations. The CARES Act, a big part of the CARES Act was a bailout of the fossil fuel industry, which many folks don't know, and so many other aspects of things were pushed into this legislation, and we have been distracted by fighting over paltry amounts of relief, $400, $600, $2,000. And so really, again, we are constantly being pushed, hopefully, to join the movements that exist, that are fighting for the better world that is possible, the better world that we all deserve.
I noticed that the last word you said was deserve. And that actually linked into something that I had been thinking about as all of you were speaking, which is an idea that a number of commentators have pointed out: the myth of deservingness in the American experience, and the fear that anybody who is undeserving will get any benefit, any advantage, and how entwined this has been with the conversation about COVID relief, about the ability to actually provide some government assistance to people who so desperately need it. And then, of course, how intertwined with race those stories are, how much of this language is coded, how much of it is dog whistling. When we talk about people being undeserving, there are very clear connotations there. And there was a question asked in the pre-submitted sequence, kind of discussing the issue of monuments and flags and statues as symbols of America. And I think that there is a conversation to be had here about the power of some of these myths, some of this symbolism, the way that is influencing the dialogues that we're able to have, and how powerful these things are able to be. I think possibly emphasized for white people in new ways when they saw the Confederate flag in the Capitol. And of course, these are conversations that we've, that Black activists have been trying to to initiate, to advance for years. And so I wondered what you thought in at a moment when there are so many active problems, when there are so many tangible problems that are affecting all of us, what significance we should give to some of these arguments, discussions, debates, conversations about symbolism, about narrative, about myth making, and the role that that is playing in contemporary society.
Well, I can start by just saying it's very important, it's very powerful, and it's central. Michael and I have been part of a long fight here in Dallas to rid the city of Confederate monuments. There still are some vestiges in Fair Park, but in the midst of the uprising this summer, finally, the one that was the only public art seen outside of the convention center right across from City Hall was taken down. There are still 30% of the streets in Dallas named after Confederate soldiers and Confederate leaders. Symbols represent the values and the ethos of a society. And when people say, well, it doesn't really matter, if it didn't matter, it wouldn't have been fought so much. I personally joined the fight when my son was 5 years old. He turns 11 this year, right? And so we haven't changed any street names. That was us removing 2 monuments, right? Nearly 6 years of a battle. If it didn't mean anything, then we wouldn't be fighting it so much. We wouldn't have had the image of the Confederate flag in the White, and not the White House, but the Capitol. So I think that the symbols are very much related to the structural mechanisms that exist. And many of us talk about, and understand, even if on a shallow level, slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, right? But fail to recognize those mechanisms today in all the ways that they exist. But also the redlining of today is marijuana policy. Right. So the fact that on the federal level, it is illegal, but on a state by state basis, it is legalized. What that does is the only people who are able to join that market have to have access to capital. Right? Who has access to multi-millions of dollars of liquid assets? And by liquid assets, I mean cash. White folks. So Black folks who have been criminalized and hurt by marijuana policies for decades are now left out of the market to build wealth in, right? So this is redlining in the present day, and these things are the functions and the structures that are represented in the monuments of white supremacy, right? And so many people talk about it as like, and by so many people, I mean white people who say, oh, that is my heritage. You are tearing down history. But the actual history of those monuments were that they were erected as symbols of white supremacy and as markers of white terror, and so that is the history of those monuments, and they must be eradicated, torn down, and really, quite frankly, my favorite of all of it is what we saw in Richmond, Virginia, where it was light, not only graffiti and but lights were projected onto the statue, repurposing and really reclaiming all of that symbolism.
I would say that this was the greatest educational project I've ever been involved in. People may have grown unaware of the statue. They may have walked by it and everything like that, but they didn't know the history surrounding it. So when I started teaching college in 2001, it was commonplace for white students to tell me the Civil War was about states' rights. Since the Confederate Monument movement, I've seen, and this is anecdotal, but I've seen a precipitous drop in the number of students who don't, when they are first asked, they say slavery. We had conversations in Dallas that had not been held since the monuments went up. With the first one, the last one, the big one to come down, was put up in the 1890s. And right by our convention center, we were really proud of it, putting it right there in a prominent place. No conversation about that. I recall, we renamed 4 elementary schools too. And I recall getting a call from a Dallas school board member about William Cowbell Elementary. And people were saying, well, maybe we should rename that because he was elected mayor of Dallas 3 different times. He contributed to the city. I said, do you know the war crimes he committed in Arkansas during the war? Do you know? And I'm going to say something that will be upsetting, but his soldiers captured African Americans in the Union Army, and they had competitions to kill people with wagon wheels, crush their heads with wagon wheels. That was the mayor of Dallas, elected 3 times after the Civil War, and he was shocked. People had passed under, and it's now a much different demographic going to that school. Even if it's just white people, though, there's something immoral and abuse of children's minds to uphold. We got to reach people in a way about an honest reckoning with that past through the process of removing memorials that made it absolutely key. Because if you don't acknowledge that history, then it's easy to minimize the inequities of today.
I thought the conversation nationally about the monuments was pretty intriguing because, again, I'm from Detroit, and even though we are mostly like Black city, the only monument I remember getting taken down is in Campus Marshes, which is downtown Detroit, a few blocks away because I live downtown. It was a statue of Christopher Columbus, and it was removed. And even the uproar about that, when we to this day know the atrocities and violence and rape and murder that Christopher Columbus had committed, it was almost, well, the rhetoric behind it was it's history. How we're not going to know our history now just because of this one monument. And it just, to me, the conversation was just really surprising. But also, when I used to work at the Charles H. Wright museums, I do believe that things, monuments or things that we should not necessarily celebrate today should be placed in museums. I remember when I was in the museum, I found we had boxes of KKK regalia. I mean, of course, we're not going to have people put it on and march down the street, but we have it for educational purposes, so, and we would not just put it out in the exhibition. The exhibition would have to be, shaped around something. And then that's when we would use those type of items. But again, I agree with Dr. Phillips. A lot of people didn't know the history of a lot of these monuments that are up. And as soon as the conversation started about removing them and how they were offensive or how they were disrespectful, that's again when you see that aspect of white supremacy come out again, and it becomes like it's like a personal attack on white people when it's not, when you never knew the history, you didn't even know the connection between it, and then now when you hear this, you see this one article or you see this one post on Facebook, now you're upset and you want to march and protect this monument that if this was never brought up, you wouldn't even have stopped one time to care. So I just thought it was pretty interesting, again, because I don't experience that, because again, you all are in the South. So I have never been to Texas. I've never been to Dallas. So I don't know. But we really don't have monuments up here like that. I just remember the Christopher Columbus thing and how that just blew up and became quite ridiculous.
Great, thank you. I think that given the time frame, that we should shift gears just slightly to take some questions from the audience, if there are people who want to ask some questions of our panelists. Oh, and I wanted to add, we're having some trouble just with the spotlighting. If you are not a panelist, could you please turn your camera off? Thank you.
I have a question. I would have loved to hear you guys' or everyone's standpoint on the Texas Rangers. I know you're not in Texas, but you know, in Texas we have the Texas Rangers baseball team, and then we have the Texas Rangers, or the police force. And I would love to hear your thoughts on the Texas Rangers. We even have a Texas Rangers museum near, I believe, near Waco. So, and which has been asked, and people are fighting to kind of get the museum repurposed to, you know, perhaps be a museum for something different. But I would love to hear your input on the Texas Rangers, and since we're talking about monuments and reclamation of that.
There's an excellent history that deals with that, written by Ben Johnson, who used to be an SMU professor, and he focuses on that period during the Mexican Revolution, 1915 to 1920. The Texas Rangers engaged in mass murder. It's a chapter of Texas history that many people don't know about, but there were literally thousands of Latinx people slaughtered by Texas Rangers in this period, because revolutionaries would cross the border into Texas. They would sometimes issue proclamations, and there's a fear that they would radicalize the labor that was being exploited. Mexican labor was being exploited for sharecropping, agricultural work, and there was a fear that the politics would affect Texas politics. And so there was just rampaging mass murder in this period. And of course, Texas Rangers throughout their history have been a force of oppression of Black people, and an agency that ignores civil liberties, due process, fabricated evidence. They have this reputation of being super professional, more professional than the local police departments, but there are many sorry chapters in their history that call that into question. So I think, if we're going to defund police, we might look at the Texas Rangers. They're not an innocent force, and I'm certainly for renaming the baseball team. It's interesting how heated those conversations get, but it's one worth having.
And it's confusing, but it all boils down to accountability. The Texas Rangers can take over a local, problem, but it still works out that nobody, gets charged, or the police don't get charged with murder. So it's about accountability, and that's what we need. I mean, we're having all kinds of meetings, we're having all kinds of stuff, but what are we going to do about it and make people accountable for what they do?
And I would say to that point, what I would challenge us to think about is moving our society away from the punishment framework and moving towards a framework where we recognize harm and we address harm. And policing and incarceration has been wholly inadequate in, number one, addressing harm, right? And even naming harm, because even when we talk about accountability and crime, et cetera, only 10% of things that are considered crimes are even reported. So we don't, the amount of harm that is in our societies and in our communities goes undetected and unaccounted for. And so to your point, Mr. Lonnie. Yeah, Mr. Lonnie, I think what we need to really move towards is, what does accountability look like outside of structures of punishment? Outside of structures of punishment and in inhumanity in terms of like incarceration, et cetera, and how can we create mechanisms that respond to harm and repair harm?
Okay. So if you are a police officer, you walk in somebody's house and shoot them, you need to be accountable for it.
Right. And I envision, and that actually happened to me. So that is my own personal story in terms of losing my father. And what I'm saying is I want us to even move beyond the idea that we have police that are in positions to cause that type of harm. So can we think of a world beyond policing and into a world where we don't have mechanisms of that are rooted in anti-Blackness and harming us? Can we move towards systems that are rooted in our safety?
Thank you. There's a question in the chat that I think continues that thread of thinking about how we can envision different and innovative and alternative ways of moving forward. Asking, what role can educational organizations play in making sure that this information is accessible for students? And then also, what do you believe is the responsibility that higher ed has in creating spaces to rectify the harm that those institutions themselves have caused and still cause?
So this is a multi-layered, I'll try to get one part of it, but it's a multi-layered response on my end. And you know, there are so many people on this call that I think there's brilliance amongst all of us. So I hope that others will chime in as well. But one is, we know that the wealth that a lot of these institutions hold, particularly Ivy League institutions, are based in slavery, are based in and capitalize off of the sins of this country, and so it is important to create reparation frameworks and models. So that is one answer. The other is one of the, I would say one of the challenges and also one of the beautiful parts of being in higher ed is the tension, right? Like you are dealing with and grappling with the ideology of people, of a community, of a world, etc. And you have this opportunity to have these fights and to create a microcosm of what we should have in our society. And so I say that to say, you know, in my own personal experience as an undergrad and then a graduate student, I was constantly in fights, you know, and as an undergrad student, I was fighting for the unionization of adjunct faculty, right? And so if you don't know the difference between adjunct faculty and tenure faculty, that's an education I would suggest that you get into, because in a lot of ways, universities are modeled after plantation systems. You know, they're set up in that same mechanism in terms of labor, intellectual labor, and also physical labor in so many ways. And so how do we create an economic conversion into systems that are equitable and just? That's a big fight, and I think every new generation has to take that fight up. One of my favorite quotes that is a North Star for me is Frantz Fanon, and he said, out of like basically relative obscurity, each generation has to discover its mission and then either fulfill it or betray it, right? And so every moment gives us a mission to either fulfill or betray. And I think the types of policies that exist, you know, even the architecture of the schools. I know at UTD, for example, in the student dorms, so much of things are key card access, and you can't go here, you can't go there, and that creates a difficulty in organizing and connecting and creating community. So how does the infrastructure of our campuses create community or not create community? How do the policies create community or keep us away from community? I think UTD had a really personally, I feel like the response to COVID was better than other institutions, but there have been other issues in terms of how do you deal with racism on campus? How do you deal with sexual assault, etc.? What are the norms that you as a community want to set? And you have to push and advocate and fight for them. You're muted, Michael.
Hold on. All right, here I am. It's true that the TAs aren't unionized and don't have job protections and are exploited. Most college professors aren't tenured. And how does that relate to our conversation? The lack of tenure is a powerful force towards censorship, what you are willing to take a risk to teach. I got threatened. I'm at a community college with no tenure protection. I got threatened by my administration when I got involved in the Confederate monuments issue. This afternoon, we just had 2 professors at my college fired because they criticized the college's COVID policies. If you're going to deal with sexuality, if you're going to deal with racism in medicine, if you're going to deal, I got targeted by a right-wing group called Campus Reform. I tweeted something, and I was half joking, where I said living under Donald Trump was like having Ted Bundy as president, famous serial killer, right? And it was when he said 100,000. Campus Reform did a big story on me. They wrote to my college president. We are under real pressure, and I think it's a shame because there is a disconnect between what students learn in public school, which is where most of the history is delivered, and what they get in higher education. My students get history that could have been taught in the 1950s. I joke about, parade of dead white men, right? White presidents, and a lot of students put off having history, and increasingly because of the corporatization of colleges, because the shredding of academic freedom, that Campus Reform group, that right-wing group, targets professors who teach critical race theory. They realize that can change the ground we walk on. They realize that higher ed can be a powerful force for change, and they're undermining it. And unfortunately, professors tend to not make a sympathetic proletariat. They have trouble seeing us as oppressed workers, even though most of us have contingent labor. TAs at my college get paid $2,900 to teach a full semester, 1 class. And they're only going to give you 4 classes because they'll have to give you insurance if they give you a 5th. A mass amount of labor exploitation. So this is a key issue because we have a mission. We have things we can tell. We could teach the teachers, but it's becoming increasingly risky to do so.
Thank you. We are approaching the end of our time. I wanted to see if anybody had a last word or a closing thought that they wanted to get in.
I really was impressed by this panelist. I don't think the audience knows how heroic Sarah Mccurry's work has been over the years, and the dramatic change she has made in so many people's lives. And tackling police power is a high risk venture. And she's been relentlessly brave and eloquent. And it's always an honor to do an event with her. I think she's heroic, and I appreciate her work. And Dallas, Dallas filled with people like her would be a different place.
Well, I am humbled by your words. Thank you so much. And the feeling is mutual. I feel like I always learn so much from you, Michael. You are a brilliant force. And for those white folks who wonder, who do I create a lineage with? I would say you are one to model themselves after. And Ryan, I really appreciate your insight, your sharing, and you're in the cold, D. It was great to share space with you. And thank you all so much. I really appreciate the UTD family. Thank you for the invite.
Thank you all. And sorry, was that Ryan? Did you want to? Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you all for having me. I really appreciated being a part of this panel, and I definitely look forward to looking at both you, Michael and Sarah's work and reading about you. I definitely learned a lot hearing what you all were saying, and I'm very grateful to be a part of this panel, and thank you all again for inviting me. It was very inspirational.
Thank you. I will just echo that by saying that I'm so grateful to have been able to participate in this tonight and to have been able to contribute to putting this together. And I also have learned a great deal and have a lot to be thinking about over the days and weeks ahead and to bring back to my classrooms as well. Dr. Evans, did you want to conclude?
Yes, I do. I just want to just echo everything that's already been said and just say thank you all so much for our three wonderful panelists. And I just had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Phillips and Sarah for this event. But I've known Ryan since she was in graduate school. So just very, very pleased to be able to have the opportunity to invite her to this event. And I also want to thank our sponsors for tonight, helping to make it possible, and just all my co-organizer, Destiny as well, Destiny Talbert, as well as everyone that's on our Black Lives Matter Planning Committee. We have a wonderful committee, and they're just always willing to work hard. And also, Dr. Werhnyak is on our committee as well too. And thank you for serving as our moderator tonight. You did a wonderful job as well. And I just want to end by just pointing out, and a lot of this has already been said, but over the past couple weeks, we've definitely had some great monumentous moments to celebrate. As a Black community, we have honored the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And also we had the historic inauguration of my sorority sister, Kamala Harris, as vice president. But there's also a lot, as it's been shared tonight, there has certainly been a lot of heartbreak and challenge as well, too, from Black individuals being more susceptible to COVID-19, to the systemic racism that continues to occur. So our hope for tonight is that while, again, there are certainly a lot of things that still a lot of work that needs to be done, our hope is that everyone walks away with a plan of some sort of action item of how can I actively engage in anti-racism work. So hopefully you all have a good plan for 2020. I'm sorry, 2021 and onward. And just again, just want to thank our attendees as well too for spending this evening with us. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. And we'll have more details about that out soon.
Thank you, everyone.